I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. Well, Mr. Michael Regina, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Michael Regina. I'm the editor and creator of Read with Real Comics, a YouTube channel all about comics, comic creators, and yeah, really excited to be here.
Yes, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Read the freaking comics. What defines a comic and how does it differ from graphic novel?
So usually a comic is defined as a single issue, 22 to 24 pages, depending, with a stapled issue, soft cover. Usually, one or two stories are within in the binding. A graphic novel could be a longer story, could be 50 to 100 pages, could be hardcover, could be softcover, um, or it could be a compendium of stories, rather like collection of a single comic book arc or a single character storyline. That's basically what the difference is between the two.
Very well said, Mr. So, what are the most popular genre in the world of comics?
Well, there's different genres and there's different styles for everybody. So we all know that manga is pretty massive around the world. This is the Japanese, Asian inspired type of comic books. Typically, they are sort of techno based or have some sort of technological aspect to them. Although there's tons of different manga out there, that subgenre has its own specific subgenre genres within it, of course. There's also, of course, the very basic superhero genre of comics. These are the fairly standard ones and ones people most know about, which is the superheroes that you know and love: Superman, Batman, Spider Man, these types. There's also different types of genres. There's westerns with featuring stories from the Western period, the Wild West period, out in Western America. There's sci-fi comics specifically that type of genre with aliens and that type of thing. There's also murder mysteries. There's also just generic day in the life type comics that are really about uh, the real life stories and journeys of maybe slightly comical characters or maybe more dramatic characters, love lives of different people of all walks of life. So comics really span that range of the most insane sort of storyline you've ever heard of before to the more mundane data life situations.
Mr. Michael Regina, thank you for. Where's my clap? Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about comics. We love comics, people. We love comics. So, how do comics combine text and visuals to tell a story?
That's a great question. So the way comics use text and visuals to tell a compelling story really depends on who the artist is, what the genre is, and how they want to go about telling a story. But essentially, the basics are comics tell stories through speaking bubbles. We've all seen these before. These are talking bubbles where you can actually read what the person is saying or even thinking. And depending on the age that you're looking at your comic book, meaning the modern age or the silver age, the bronze age of comics, there might be more narration to explain the exposition of the storyline by the characters themselves, or there's this over omnipresent character that is helping explain and guide the reader through what the story is going on or the history of the background of these characters through these boxes that are shown that are not voice boxes but are just sort of thought boxes that appear at the top or bottom of a panel. to explain to you, what is happening, why this character is referencing someone that maybe is not in the scene. Well, that's because it happened last issue, that type of thing. But there's all different types of comics. There's comics that have very minimal dialogue, so it's really telling a story through visuals. There's comics that are overabundance of dialogue, and you're reading mainly you're reading a novel basically with minimal character action. But yeah, there's a wide variety of that. But the very basics you'll see are, of course, characters telling a story, talking through this story with to the audience through various thought bubbles, various talking bubbles or thought bubbles throughout the comic.
Very well said, Mr. Michael. So, how has the comic book format evolved over time?
Um, so comics have been around for over 100 years now. They've been a staple of the newsprint industry for many, many years. They've gone through rises and falls in popularity, but also in the way users have ingested those comics. So typically, you would buy your comics off of newsstands or spinner racks back in the day. So these spinner racks are these type of racks that you might see at a bookstore or at a pharmacy or your local store that do exactly what they say. They spin so you can read all the comics there and pick the one that interests you the most. Um, and then by the late 80s, early 90s, specialty stores started popping up where these stores sold only comic books. And you can get all kinds of books, graphic novels, all these types of things in these specialty stores. During a period in the 90s when speculation about the value of comics went through the roof and there was a bit of a comic bubble, a lot of people lost a lot of money when that bubble burst in the later 90s, and some of these stores suffered and they had to close down. But they've found a way to diversify since then in selling not just comics, but there's different paraphernalia, there's clothing lines, there's different collectibles. That's really, really huge as well. And so, really, how people consume comics has always been changing. And now, of course, there's a digital aspect of consuming comics. You can purchase basically a subscription to a lot of these larger publishers, consume comics digitally on your phone. And what's interesting with that is, from the ones that I've seen, is that the consumption of the comic just doesn't show up on your page on your screen and you have to zoom in and read what you want. They actually guide you through that process. So when you click on the image, it'll show the text box that you should be reading, and you click the next button, and it'll flow to the next text box. So it's very interesting because I've actually had people who say, "Hey, when I was new to comics, I didn't know how to read the comic book correctly because I didn't know, like, I knew you started at the top left, but then I didn't know if I should, if the conversation flows to that character, or do I do the next panel, or do I go across the page, that kind of thing. Things that comic book readers intuitively learn to understand, but people new to the comic book genre might have gotten a little lost occasionally. So that's a big tool that digital comics have that traditional print comics do not.
Interesting. Now comics become digital. Wow.
Mhm.
Really evolving. So, why are comics considered a unique form of storytelling?
So you can think of comics as the it's basically the next step, the next evolution in telling fireside stories, right? So back in the day, there was before the invention of the printing press, it was very difficult to get stories out in book format because it would take forever to actually replicate these books. Once the printing press came out, and it was very easy to replicate books using ink and print, of course, comics followed suit, and it was a very easy to recreate comic content on a printed form. And it sort of took over where those fireside chats or those stories passed down from generation to generation take place, and comic books have always been sort of really attached to books in general, the book format in general, and how that's moved and changed across the ages. Comics have always sort of been next to that as well. So it's very similar to that sort of same journey that it's taken. Paperback books or sorry books, paper books, and the way they've changed and the way they've evolved in terms of how people consume them.
What are the origins of comic books as a medium?
So that's an interesting question. The origins, as far as I know, like I had mentioned, were in the early days of print, when there were stories to be told. There were dime store books called Penny Dreadfuls. These types of books that were some had some drawings attached to them. Mostly had text print, right? So that's where the sort of the origins of a lot of these stories have come from, where they were able to replicate the printing process and be able to make these things en masse. Eventually, artists around the world started generating stories in this type of form that would be able to be consumed en masse, where there was less actual copy there, and the images were starting to tell that story. And so, as people sort of evolved in terms of their consumption of these types of books, more and more publishers were looking for artists who can actually do this type of thing, be able to tell stories in a visual medium. And that's sort of how the industry came about.
So, how did the golden age of comics shape the industry?
So, in fact, the golden age of comics was, of course, the most popular time for comics consumption during that period. And what essentially occurred is um, a lot of really creative people started to bring about their creations to the mainstream, and so it started to get more and more consumed by the younger generations who were actually grown up learning how to read, because a lot of people before that, learning how to read wasn't necessarily something that you needed to do to to stay in school and keep an education. So these people are starting to learn how to read. They were starting to be able to consume different content. A lot of people went overseas during the war. They started to see what the French were doing for in terms of comics. That's a massive industry in France, the comic industry, and some of them, when they came back from the war, were actually starting to create comics themselves and sort of emulate that process. And so the golden age started even before World War II, and it was that period where you saw, the creations of a lot of pop culture comic heroes, but of course, the biggest being Superman. Of course, that was one of the earliest superheroes that is still popular to this day. And so, why that period is defined as the golden age is really because a lot of characters and a lot of creative types sort of came together at that same time, and were able to uh, create content and create characters that are still popular to this day.
So, how do comics reflect cultural and societal changes?
Great question. So where we see where we see that sort of reflection is really, like you said, in the pages themselves. So what are the attitudes towards political figures, towards authority types? What are the attitudes towards minorities or different races and sexual orientations? You can actually see that reflected in the way the characters and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in comic books. So who are the antagonists, who are the protagonists, and that changes and morphs through time. And so, case in point, when a comic book series called The Nam came out, this was post Vietnam War, but a lot of people were still really interested in hearing stories from these Vietnam vets, and so there were a lot of stories about Vietnam that were sort of in the popular zeitgeist at the time. So when the Marvel series The Nam came out in the '80s, that became a really popular series simply because the storylines and the the interest was there for people to consume it. And so that's how it affects sort of what popular culture is, right? So, case in point, we have a lot of characters in the last 10, maybe 5, 10 years. Some characters have come out as non-binary or as um, homosexuals, these kind of things, and that is a reflection of what we're seeing in society, where this has become more accepted, this has become more understanding, and so these characters reflect this as well, right? And some of these characters also have to go through their journeys and saying how they were feeling that they could not come out and be themselves at a certain period of time, and now that they feel more comfortable doing so. So society really holds up a mirror. Comic books really hold up a mirror rather to society to show what they are currently experiencing.
Definitely a freaking comics, people. So, what are the differences between Western comics, manga, and manhwa?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it boils down to the basic stories that they tell and the outcomes of some of their characters. So Western comics um, tend to have the hero overcoming some sort of particular peril that they're going through in their life, storyline, and it's reflected in these absurdist ways, right? So it's not going to be like, oh, I don't feel like I'm good enough at my job and my boss is going to fire me. It's, oh, I feel like I have failed because this entire city blew up and I'm a failure at what I do as a hero, right? So it's reflecting these types of storylines, but magnified in a very very absurdist kind of way for us to sort of understand that the stakes are much higher in that kind of world. And what you see with manga comics is a slightly different, more personalized stories where things can be similarly magnified in that way, but maybe the storylines are slightly darker, maybe the plot lines are slightly darker in that way. And so, especially Western comics, some ebbs and flows in terms of we want this character to be more darker, we want this character to be more lighter in terms of tone. And so the comic creators and writers try to get an understanding of what is popular and what isn't popular to shift the tone of their characters, of their storylines, to best reflect what is selling, because honestly that's what it is all about, is trying to sell these comics and storylines, trying to make money off of them, turn them into movie franchises, turn them into whatever it is. But that's how they sort of get their understanding of how they're the type of tone they should have for their creations.
Of course, people, money, money, money. The trend is all about money. So, who are some of the most iconic comic book characters of all time?
Well, I think a lot of the biggies are ones that you probably know, and ones that most common people will know. Those that have never even picked up a comic book will know who Superman is, who Spider-Man is, who Batman is.
Yes.
These are not just comic characters; they are now sort of part of the everyday vernacular. And you would be hard pressed to find someone who didn't know who Superman was. They might give you a different answer and say, "Oh no, he's from the movies," or "Oh, that's the guy from the TV show," or whatever it is. But essentially, these are all comic book characters, and the tops are still the tops. But what you'll find is during different periods, during different decades or part of the decades, you have the popularities of certain characters come and go. That could be due to the artists or the writers working on those series at the time. That could be due to the story arcs that they've created. Like I mentioned, sometimes publishers and writers go in one direction and the audience is really heading in another direction. So the popularity ebbs and flows. Case in point, when Batman was not at the peak of its popularity, Warner Brothers decided to make a Batman film with Tim Burton, and at the time, looking at the comics, what was selling at the time was X-Men and Marvel. So Marvel and X-Men were just tops every month, every week. There was an X-Men comic that was number one. The month that that Tim Burton movie came out, then suddenly all Batman titles had become number one, and they stayed that way for a couple of years. And Batman just became there was just Batman everywhere, and so the popularity doesn't just need to necessarily grow generically from the comics and what they're doing. There's outside influences now, such as, like I said, the Batman movie, or different influences from television show or animation or whatever it is that is just driving that popularity.
Totally agree. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman.
Mm,
So,
absolutely.
what makes a comic book character compelling or relatable?
Um, so that's a great question. So what I hear, what I feel rather, is that a comic book character needs to be relatable when they are not completely immune, immortal, and untouchable. Although there's some cases for that. You can build a really, really interesting character who has very, very strong, is very, very strong in terms of their powers and their abilities. But it's a character who is relatable in many other ways. They have flaws. They have families. I mean, most of us, almost all of us, have families that we can relate to. They have obstacles they need to overcome. Now, like I mentioned, those obstacles might be, hey, there's a meteor coming to destroy the planet, whereas our everyday obstacles are, hey, I have a parking ticket. How do I pay for that? So very, very different. But for some reason, we can relate to those obstacles, and we can say, okay, how is our hero going to get through this quandary? A lot of moral questions are also asked as well. So, this hero that we've known and loved for years, suddenly, are they doing something that crosses the line, right? Are they doing something that might be good for the people, but maybe morally is questionable? And so that makes it very interesting to see that dynamic shift and say, "Hey, what's going to happen next?" Because I'm really curious about this character. He or she tends to be moving in this direction that is really, really ambiguous and kind of difficult. How are they going to navigate this? How are they going to get out of this situation? And of course, I think one thing when we talk about characters, we talk about heroes most of the time, but what makes a character great is the villains that they associate with, right? Their rogues gallery, as they say in comic terms. Who are their typical enemies that they fight with? And a villain and a hero is only as good as the enemies that he has. So it's very, very interesting to see, like, is it Superman and Lex Luthor? Is it Batman and the Joker? Like, what are these two? Which two elements together make for a really great storyline? That's what makes a character popular.
So, Mr. Michael, what are your top five freaking comics to be recommended?
Well,
Highly recommended.
yeah. Which ones do I recommend? So I definitely recommend Mike Mignola's work on Hellboy, which is an Image Comics title. Um, Really, you could start at number one for Hellboy, and flow through that series. Hellboy is a really, really interesting character, drawn really dynamically. Mike Mignola has done work on Batman as well. His work is really, really interesting the way he draws. I absolutely adore that comic. Highly recommend it. The new Absolute series, so Absolute Batman, Wonder Woman, what's the third one? Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman. Excuse me. Those three are really, really good, and they're working really, really well. This is a new Absolute universe that DC has created, and is looking really, really interesting. The first issue of Batman, Absolute Batman, was sold out, went for a second reprint. I believe that second one is sold out too. I'm not too sure, but yeah, it's working really well. The other series that I'm enjoying right now has to be, let me see. I'd have to say Spider Man is getting very interesting right now. People are starting to say, like, people were sort of getting tired of some storylines from Spider Man. It is starting to pick up. I definitely think that's something we want to pick up soon. Um, and two more. That's interesting. What else did I? What else have I liked recently? Um, I have to say, I'd have to say, Rat City from Spawn. That is a new one that I've picked up recently. So this is Spawn is a character from I think it's Vertigo Comics. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that one. So Spawn is a very interesting character from Vertigo Comics because the nature of what Spawn is, you can have a version of Spawn that is in different time periods. So very similar to Ghost Rider. For those who know Ghost Rider, yeah, a spawn is a someone who who elects to become the spawn of whatever period they're in. So they've been modern day spawns, of course, and then there's been spawn in the past, but now there's spawn set in the future time. So this is really really interesting. Really loving that look. Um, the last one, I would say I would leave that one open. I want your readers to go to their local comic shops and pick up
Yes.
something they've never heard of before. That's my last recommendation is to go and look at something that looks interesting to you, that catches your eye, that you've never heard of before, because that is the best way to expand your palette beyond maybe the Supermans and Spider-Mans of the world. That's what I would say.
Yes, people discover the freaking comics out there. So, to
Yeah.
sum up our discussion, Mr. Michael, so how do superheroes dominate the comic book landscape and why?
So I would say superheroes dominate um, not just the comic book landscape. They've been fairly dominant in the movie
Movies.
landscape as well. They've been working really well in comics, in trade paperbacks and graphic novels as well. And so I think people really enjoy a good superhero story where there is somebody overcoming some obstacle, some peril that they've experienced, and um, and people just really want to live in that superhero's cape, I guess, for that period of time, and just say like they've overcome this obstacle, I can overcome my obstacles too. Plus, for this brief period where I'm reading this comic, I'm going to be able to fly, so I'm gonna enjoy the hell out of it. And I think that's precisely why people really love to read comic books.
Definitely. Mr. Michael Regina, again, thank you so much for your knowledge about freaking comics.
Thank you.
And again, can you please invite our listeners to support your blog on
Yes,
YouTube?
absolutely. So head on over to YouTube and you can search "Read the Freaking Comics." You'll be able to find it. Very distinctive coloring. You can please subscribe, ring the bell, so that you get all the notifications. And yeah, once a week you'll see a nice video about a deep dive of a historical comic from myself.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Michael Regina. Read the freaking comics and share to the world. So, Mr. Michael, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
More to come, people. See you soon. So, Mr. Michael, I'm inviting you again next year because of this following probably middle of